so many people here, and it's also really nice to see a mix of both staff and students, I think. So thank you for taking time away from your busy day. Just to briefly introduce myself, so my name's Leanne Freeman, and I occupy a dual role within the university. So 2 days a week I work for our Quality Enhancement Directorate, and work on various projects that enhance learning and teaching across the university. And then 3 days a week I'm a lecturer in psychology. So I've seen a couple of our psychology students pop up as they've been admitted, so it was nice to see some psychology students here. The other role that I occupy within the university is I am chair of the Women's Staff Network, which is why the careers team have asked me to host today, and it was very kind of them to send me that invite. I'm very pleased to be able to join you today. So Student Services and Employability team and myself would like to welcome you to the Women in Industry panel, and that's in celebration of International Women's Day. So this event has been created to inspire and empower you so that you can approach future steps in your career with confidence. And we've got 4 fantastic speakers today to share their experiences as leaders in their own industries and discuss the challenges that they've encountered and overcome along the way. So the theme for this International Women's Day is obviously choose to challenge, so that fits in nicely. After the event, there'll be an information pack sent out by my colleagues in careers about employers and organisations that we know of that are being supportive and progressive and are taking measures to address the gender balance in their sector or organisation. So before our panel introduces themselves, I'd like everyone to keep their cameras and microphones off, please, until the Q&A session at the end. You can then either put your questions to our speakers if you're comfortable via video or audio, or you can pop it into the chat. So I know that Natalie is going to be monitoring the chat, and I will aim to do the same as well. So now I'd like to turn to each of our panelists and ask them to introduce themselves. So I'm just going to call out names as I see them on the screen. So if we could start with Sheila, please.
Thank you, and happy International Women's Day, everybody. Great to see the numbers of people who've joined us today on such an inspiring occasion. I'm Sheila Hendrickson-Brown, and I'm Chief Executive of Cardiff Third Sector Council, which obviously means I work in the voluntary community sector. We're the membership organisation for community groups, so we provide resources, advice, information to the range of community activities that take place across the city, so that those community groups and organisations can focus on what they do best, which is obviously meeting the needs of people across Cardiff. And I'm delighted to be part of such a vibrant and important sector. My background has largely been in the third sector. I've worked as well in public services, as well as for a short time in the private sector. And my background is law. My degree is in law, and I've always had a passion for social justice and equalities. So that's really what's informed my career path and the decisions that I've taken. And again, champion in the community sector, I'm involved on a voluntary basis, both currently and have been throughout my working history, and really believe that we own the responsibility, which is a joyous one, to show agency in terms of supporting our communities and the people around us to do the best that they can and achieve the best that they can. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Sheila. So next on my screen is Caroline.
Thank you, Leanne. It's great to be here today. Thank you so much for asking me to join you. My name is Cara Aitchison. I am Head of Partnerships at Alacrity in Newport, which is a tech incubator. But I've had quite an interesting path that led me here. I had 30 years in corporate life, all the way through from working in branch banking with NatWest to leading big teams. Then I made a couple of crazy decisions, which were right for me. I was the chief exec of Be the Spark for Wales, and then ended up in Alacrity. But in addition to my day job, I'm also the chair of a Welsh Government panel for supporting entrepreneurial women in Wales. So yeah, but it's deep.
Lovely, thank you, Caroline. And then next on my screen is Laura.
Hello, Brynhawn da, everybody. Happy International Women's Day from me as well. Real pleasure to join you at this event. My name is Laura McAllister. I'm a professor at Cardiff University in the Wales Governance Centre, which is part of the School of Law and Politics. And my specialism is devolution, intergovernmental relations and constitutional politics. So it's a busy time for us, as you can imagine, at the moment, with Senedd elections on the horizon and lots of conversations about the future of the Union. The other hat I wear is in sport. I'm formerly chair of Sport Wales for 2 terms. I'm a board member of the Football Association of Wales, and I'm currently contesting an election. First election I've contested for a heck of a long time for a place on FIFA Council, the world governing body of football. So the election currently, unless it's changed, is happening on the 20th of April, and it's an election for a designated place for a woman from the Confederation onto FIFA. So in this case, from UEFA onto FIFA, and I'm in a straight fight with a lady from Italy. So watch this space.
Thanks, Laura. And then last but not least, I'm sure she's familiar to hopefully all of you who have joined us, but we've got Cara next.
Thank you, and happy International Women's Day to everyone. I'm Cara Aitchison. I'm President and Vice Chancellor of Cardiff Metropolitan University, and I'm one of around 150 leaders of UK universities, of which around 30 are now women. I'm in my 8th year of being a Vice Chancellor. I was Vice Chancellor and Chief Executive Officer of Plymouth Mordaunt University, Cardiff in 2016. I'm 56 years old. I've been working in higher education since I was 23. When I graduated from my undergraduate degree in geography from Edinburgh University in the 1980s, I had absolutely no intention of coming into education for a career, and really no intention of becoming a senior leader. Like many women without a clear career plan, my journey's been meandering rather than linear. I've now worked in 8 universities across the UK and across the sector, from London, Cheltenham, Bristol, Bedford, Edinburgh, Plymouth, and now Cardiff. I'm really interested in social justice and environmental sustainability, and I've undertaken research and advocacy across a range of equality, inclusion, diversity projects spanning not just gender, but also sexuality, ethnicity, disability, and even religious identity. So I've published quite widely as a researcher, but I've also become very interested in advocacy, and I've held a number of roles outside universities that have been concerned with promoting equality and diversity, particularly for women. And I was a board member and non-executive director of the Equality Challenge Unit, which is concerned with promoting equality and diversity in the higher education sector. I was chair of the UN-created Commission on Women and Gender for the World Leisure Association for 8 years, seeking to implement the UN sustainability goals in relation to gender equality. I was chair of the Women and Gender Studies Association for the UK and Ireland's largest ever Gender Studies Conference quite some time ago, where we tried to put female genital mutilation on the agenda and sponsored a number of African delegates to come and speak to that topic and to raise awareness. And then most recently and currently and finally, I'm chair of Universities UK Staff Student Sexual Misconduct Advisory Group, and on Wednesday we will be launching guidelines to try to seek cultural change across universities to make the higher education environment more receptive to equality, diversity, and to protecting the rights of women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara. So I've now got a list of questions. I don't think we're going to get through all of them, but I will start off, and if audience members would like, if you think of questions as we're going through the panel, please feel free to pop them in the chat, and then we can pick them up when we come to the Q&A session at the end. So Cara kind of just spoke well about this, and it will be interesting to see what Laura has to say about this, given her FIFA campaign at the moment. We've got a quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Women belong in all places where decisions are being made, and it shouldn't be that women are the exception. I also like the quote from her where she said she was going to stop fighting when all 9 Supreme Justice members are female. So what do you think that women bring to the workplace, and what do you think women bring to leadership roles? So if we can start off with Laura, it'd be interesting to hear your reflections on this, given your FIFA campaign at the moment.
Yeah, well, for my FIFA campaign, you could take pretty much any election or any appointment process in any field across the world, because, you know, the reality is that women are still severely disadvantaged in most scenarios where there is scarce power. And I put the emphasis on scarce power because I think we have seen advances in women's representation. Lots of us around the table today have benefited from that, and we all hold leading positions in our own sectors. So it would be wrong to suggest that no progress has been made. Progress has been made, but we need to take stock of how much further there is to go. And I'm afraid in some sectors and in some environments and at some levels of authority, it really simply isn't good enough. You know, to still have boards and executive teams where there are very few women involved, and not just very few women, but very few women who are different. So women of colour, women who might have a disability, younger women, women from different socioeconomic backgrounds. It's always a mistake to just lump everyone into this category of women and think you've solved the problem when you have some female faces around the table. I think we've got to be much more nuanced in our thinking about how we ensure that, you know, we're a heterogeneous group, of course. You know, no 2 women are identical, so we can't just assume that having 2 women around the table will solve the issues relating to gender equality. They simply won't. So I guess my point is really we've got a long way to go, but we've come some way too. What do women bring to the workplace? Well, you know, there's a really basic argument in favour of diversity, and that is you bring multiple experiences, multiple backgrounds, multiple outlooks. I mean, I research on gender and politics as well, and you know, if you go into the literature on this, you'll see a lot of writers talking about a collection of blind spots in power teams. And I think if you don't have diversity, turn this argument on its head, if you don't have diversity, not just of gender, by the way, but of race as well, and age, and lots of other identities, you risk collecting blind spots. And I think what we're talking about really is cognitive diversity, you know, where people think differently, they come at it from a different angle. And I think there's no excuse really, and no rational reason why any environment now should not be gender diverse. And in fact, if it's not gender diverse, I suspect that organisation is not performing at its maximum capacity, because, you know, a uniform board or uniform SMT with just men or just white people or just anything is likely to be missing a trick somewhere along the line. So I think it's really fundamental that we and don't lose sight of the fact that despite us having come some way, there's still a long way in the journey towards equality ahead of us too.
Yeah, I was nodding furiously with what you were saying. Sheila, have you got any comments to add to Laura's response?
Yeah, I'm from a very similar space to Laura. I think, in a way, it's to be curious as to why we have this imbalance happening. it's almost counterintuitive, right? If you want to deliver the best service or the best product or whatever, surely to goodness you want to be making decisions based on the widest range of experiences. And as Laura's rightly said, you know, that goes beyond gender, that's into all of the protected characteristics and beyond the socioeconomic. Because to have that range of perspectives surely must enrich the experience of everybody, as well as create a better outcome, I would suggest, that's going to better meet that range of needs. And it is right to suggest that, you know, sort of having any number of, whether it's men, women, whoever you have on the board, isn't about ticking a box and saying, well, we've got the women's perspective or the men's perspective. But surely the drive on all of us is to just try to create this environment, this culture of this multiplicity of perspectives to create the best outcomes for everybody. And so for me, as I say, it's curious as to how anybody could even begin to justify why they're not in that position. You know, sort of whether that's ethically, politically, socially, sustainably, just good economics. So I think it's very important. And in terms of what women bring, it's what everybody brings. It's perspective, it's balance, it's contribution, it's energy, it's you know, sort of different experiences. It broadens outlooks, it broadens options. So again, I am really challenged to understand why anybody doesn't see a logical thing to possibly have in place.
And Caroline?
I was nodding furiously also with everything that Laura and Sheila said. I just wanted to extend something that Sheila picked up, which in my career has rung true. I think we have to move past the tick box of get a woman, get someone who doesn't look like the men, you know, because if we allow that to continue and don't extend where we are, you know, I have in the past sat in leadership groups where I have been the only female, but still not been afforded a voice. And that is an even worse position, because I might as well have not been there. And the question also interested me, Leanne. What do you think women bring to the workplace? I guess we could also flip that. What do we think men bring to the workplace? Is also maybe a question we should be asking, because that's not asked that often, and I understand why we're doing it in connection of in relation to International Women's Day. But it's always quite interesting if we flip the situation, and maybe that's not a question that is asked often enough, you know. Yet it's asked of women, almost to prove what we bring to the workplace, royal we, in terms of, you know, the context of today. So yeah, loads of improvements, but still much more that can be done, for sure.
Yeah, again, lots of nodding from me. And finally, Cara.
Yeah, I'd echo many of the points made by the other speakers. I mean, I think, you know, women bring a representation of more than half of the population. So the idea that we would either exclude or diminish in, you know, percentage terms, proportional terms, the majority of the population just seems to be ridiculous. And I think women also bring a healthy disruption, often to the groupthink that, you know, any fairly homogenous group of people would bring to the table. So that disruption is really important, particularly at the moment for organisations, as we try to be quite fleet of foot and agile in our responses to lots of major challenges, not least of which, of course, is the coronavirus pandemic. And whilst I don't generally sign up to the notion of the kind of sex role stereotyping that women bring only a particular set of skills and men bring another set of skills, I'm not a great advocate of that rather dualistic thinking. I do think there is some merit in looking at those leaders that we are seeing now as being at the forefront of the response to the pandemic. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the ones that seem to be handling things best around the world are some of the women. So I think there are lessons still to be learned for senior leaders. And perhaps the current situation gives us a little kind of study in which we will learn more in the future. Thanks.
Yeah, I think a few of us have dreamt about living in New Zealand at the moment, haven't we? Yeah, I agree, and I think, you know, and I think with the theme of today's International Women's Day being choose to challenge, I think what Cara said about disruption and Caroline said about having a voice, and I think a lot of the female leaders that I admire have often spoken of having to become that woman in meetings and having to be the one who speaks up and challenges. And I think that is something that there's a lot more discussion around in terms of female leadership than male leadership. So I think, you know, that voice, the importance of the voice and it being acknowledged is really important. So moving on to the next question. So obviously some of you are, you know, working, well, all of you are working in areas that have been very dominated by men. So whether that's senior leadership in HE, football, law, you know, tech companies, what advice would you give to young women, and where we've got lots of students in this audience, what advice would you give to young women who are entering or thinking of entering a male-dominated profession or sector? And if we go with reverse order, if we could start off with Cara this time, please.
Thanks. I mean, difficult though it is, I would say just go for it. And, you know, it's that thing of we all wait as women until we're, you know, 100% confident that we're going to succeed at something before we generally stick our head above the parapets or try. And I think sometimes we've just got to take some risks and be a little bit more courageous. And with that, I would say, you know, in order to take those steps, it's really useful to have a network of support. And I think, you know, this is somewhere where within the workplace, perhaps women hold back a little bit sometimes in developing those support networks. We find, you know, some of the networking events and so on a little bit cringeworthy. Seeking out some supporters to help us with that, I think then gives us much more confidence and enables us to have a go. I'd say once you've had a go, you know, we won't always succeed first time. We have knockbacks just like everyone else. And I think it's really important not to let yourself take those too personally. Just keep on keeping on, you know, come back for another go. You know, don't admit it's a kind of personal defeat. Just learn from it, pick yourself up and celebrate your successes when they come. You know, be confident about your success. Thanks.
Thank you. And Caroline?
Yeah, just linking into what Cara said there, I would absolutely use the opportunity to try and flip it on its head in terms of not seeing going into a male-dominated profession as a barrier, but try and use those opportunities to be a pathfinder. You know, and finding those cheerleaders and those sponsors or mentors, and also male allies who will help and support you navigate the landscape, is important and doable. It links into what Cara said about networking and finding those places and keeping asking questions and not letting that put you off or stop you. I mean, I am in tech, I am not a techie. I know how to lead tech, but I couldn't write a line of code. But I bring other things to the party. So, and it's knowing that and being able to expand beyond it.
Thank you. And Sheila?
Yes, well, linking in very much to what colleagues have said previously, as well as the theme of today, which is choose to challenge. I think for me, it's just about challenging the narrative. Why should it be a big deal in that kind of sense? You know, you've taken on a role that you're competent in, or very willing to learn, you know, to enhance the competence that you bring and the skills that you bring. And the rest is, just leave it as everybody else's problem if they've got some kind of issue with that. Do you know what I mean? Because I think sometimes you can almost like buy into narratives that kind of create this shouldn't kind of aspect to where you want to go and what you want to do with your life, and what should really drive it are your interests, talents, aspirations, skills, etc. And the rest is just noise. So for me, it's just don't buy into the narrative, and surround yourself with people who support you not to buy into the narrative as well.
Lovely, thank you. And Laura?
Well, I agree with all of that. That's really good advice, and I think we've all been there, you know, and can relate to all of that. I think my advice to young women who are starting off on their career journeys is, well, a couple of things really. I think, you know, dream big. You know, don't be constrained in terms of your ambitions, because I think it's quite easy for women to get sucked into a lower level of aspiration, because there are still structural issues and, you know, and obviously personal issues around how you plan your career, you know, when you might have a family, if you want to have a family, and the timing around all of those things. So obviously there are different constraints on women to men, but don't let that restrict your dreams. You know, I mean, you know, when I think back to my childhood, you know, I grew up as an absolutely football mad kid, you know, in Bridgend. And I couldn't have imagined then that, you know, I'd be able to go on and play for my country and now stand in a major global election. But, you know, I was fortunate in having really wonderful support around me from my family and from a whole set of great mentors in my career. But I've always kind of, and I think sport does bring this to you, though the sports students here will get this straight away. You know, I think in sport, you always have high aspirations. You know, you're always looking for the next goal, the next victory, the next PB, personal best, and so on. And I think we all take that into our professional lives if we've done sport. And, you know, I think that dream big is a really, really important thing, because most men do dream big, and often they're dreaming big with less talent than women around them. So, you know, you've got to match that, really. Don't let anybody tell you that you can't be what you want to be, because you probably can, you know, in the fundamental goal. I think the question as well was about, you know, barriers and so on. And I just wanted to say something about the kind of softer climate or environment in which we all have to work. And I mean, we can only ever speak from our own experiences, but I've worked in academia and politics and sport, so I've got a decent cross-section of understanding of that. And for me, you know, these days, it's less about structural barriers. I mean, there are still some. It's less about those. It's more about the kind of softer culture of organizations and environments, which, if they don't prejudice women, they favor men. And that's probably a better way of putting it. So the networks favor men, the kind of informal chats in functions favor men, the sponsorship culture favors men, because invariably men see younger men in their own image, and therefore they like what they see. They find it harder to see their own image in a talented younger woman, and therefore they will often sponsor or promote a younger or the next generation male. But I think we can do things about that. I mean, not just using good men as allies, and there are plenty of those, but also all of us who have some authority or some leadership position have to be very strategic about how we support and sponsor and mentor other women. It really is not acceptable to be in a position of power and then not help other women around you. I think this is just a basic requirement, you know, and we need to hold each other to account on all of that. If there's a woman who has a senior position and isn't helping the next generation of women, then, you know, I think we need to call it out, because if we can't do it, nobody's going to do it, quite frankly.
Yeah, again, lots of nodding from me, and I think you're right in that we have made lots of advances, and quite often that legal, that policy framework is in place, and actually it is the softer side, it is the cultural side. So I do apologise, because I'm going to ask a question that you weren't sent in advance. I mean, as Laura's already said about role models and women supporting women, but what else can we do as women who are leaders or wanting to be leaders? What can we do to change that softer cultural, that aspect of the workplace? Cara, would you like to take up that question first? Thank you.
I find this area fascinating, and one of my areas of research was looking at that interface between the structures and the cultures, because it's not an either or, it's a both and we need to change both. And there's sometimes debate as to which comes first in making that change. And I refer to the staff student sexual misconduct work that I'm leading at the moment. And we've been very clear that, real change has to start with cultural change. And we can create all the policies and structures and procedures we like. But if these are not supported by an underpinning culture, then we'll always be on the back foot. We're always trying to take a rearguard action. And the really proactive change has to be absolutely rooted in culture. And I think, as Laura says, that requires courage. It requires us to stand up, to be counted, to call things out in ways that is not always easy. And sometimes we need to strategize to do that. We need to build networks and alliances to do that. And certainly some of the women's alliances that I've been involved in over the years have been tremendously powerful. And they kind of gained that power from their collective action. No one woman would have been able to change a culture, never mind a structure or a policy, on her own. So I think that building the alliances is powerful. And I think the other thing I would allude to, and I think this is something that we've done reasonably successfully at Cardiff Met, is to build milestones along the way. Some of the change that we want to enact is enormous, and it won't be delivered in any of our working lifetimes in its entirety. But that's no reason not to start. And, we can choose to challenge by building incremental developments and mapping these milestones and holding people to account for achieving those milestones. And I think at Cardiff Met, we've all gained quite a lot of confidence, and it's sort of buoyed up our enthusiasm by seeing that we can meet these milestones year on year. And then you look back over 3 years and you go, oh my goodness, we've transformed the number of readers and professors, or the percentage, 20% to 40%. You can make change, and if you measure it incrementally, I think it just boosts all of our confidence. Thanks.
Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to know when you're in the middle of making progress, just how much progress you've made, so that you do become fixated on the end goal, don't you, and don't see what you've achieved so far. So yeah, I'd agree with that. Caroline, can you think of any suggestions that we can utilise to improve that cultural aspect of moving towards equality?
Yeah, I think there's part of, I absolutely agree with what Laura said about influence and wanting to make a change. And it's not just talking the talk, it's also walking the walk. People watch what you do as a female leader, so it's making sure you are being authentic at every level, all the time, every day. And I don't mean that you're being permanently observed, but if you're being authentic in what you say and what you do, and helping and pulling the next generation over the wall, I think that really does help and aid the whole cultural piece and the structure, and the milestones that Cara was referring to. It's no good saying it and not doing it. That's equally as bad, isn't it?
Yeah, great. There's lots of research, isn't there, around authenticity and leadership, and really pushing that way forward. And Sheila.
Yeah, for me, in terms of that question, I think it is. Yeah, sorry, just thinking this through as I'm speaking. I think it's something about benchmarking around quite where we're coming from, because it's historically quite a small number of decades in which women have entered the workforce in the number that we have, and expected the kind of outcomes that many women now expect. And to change that around from where it was previously, where it was a male-dominated, the world of work in Britain was a male-dominated environment, and the culture and the systems were based around that. And it's trying to, I think sometimes if you bring it back to those kind of fundamentals around, okay then, this is where we started from, and this is why it's no longer working, because the dynamic has changed. The stats around the numbers of women working, etc., are obviously escalated massively over the last few decades. I think it allows you to have a bit more of a different conversation sometimes, because often people can see the kind of challenge as an attack, and what you're really trying to do is basically just sort of explain that this isn't working for everybody, and the model really could do with updating, because circumstances have changed around us, and we need to be very pragmatic about that. I think within that as well, though, part of that cultural change, I think, is not leaving behind people creating other sort of wrongdoers. I'm really averse to this kind of idea that sort of men are sort of these nasty creatures who stop. I don't think. I think obviously there are men like that. Let's not kid ourselves. But there are an awful lot who just haven't begun or have travelled very far in the journey. So I'm always very resistant to anything that sort of creates another out group in that kind of sense. So for me, a broader perspective is not about having all women in the room as your alternative model. It's about having a genuine broad sort of ray of perspectives and people in the room. And cultures that's best support that do need time to work your way through. They do need time to think about, and sometimes that you've got to be pretty adamant to challenge them. Nobody's, again, we are dealing with the reality, but I think if you bring it back down to that practical look, we're a different world now, and the rules that were then can't apply anymore. Then I think it actually gets your foot in the door, at least, to starting to have some of those more challenging conversations.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that idea about the model not being appropriate anymore, and actually we need to update the model. And I think that is something that we've all learned from COVID, and the things that we didn't think were possible in terms of online teaching and meeting online. I think that has provided that a fundamental shift in moving forward and moving away from the idea that that's how it's always been done, so we're going to carry on doing it like that. I think there are lots of opportunities available now. Laura, was there anything you wanted to add around culture change?
Well, I mean, I agree with Sheila's comments, but I don't think we should let men off the hook entirely here, because, given that sort of 80% of the world's power positions are held by men still, they have a responsibility for not being prodded into action here, but assuming responsibility for action, which is a different thing. And it's kind of unfathomable that men in organizations can't see where there are cultural disadvantages, not just to women, but maybe people of color or younger people or whatever. So I think we need to hold their feet to the fire here. It's not good enough if you're in a position of power and you're not seeing that your culture is potentially discriminatory or disadvantageous to other groups, then you're not a good leader. So, let's kind of, I just think we need to keep them, not let them off the hook completely. But we're a week after St. David's Day, and I'll refer you to something that in Welsh we call pethau bychan, small things. And I think small things can make a big difference in changing culture, actually. And there's a big thing that can change culture, which is critical mass. So when you have a critical mass of women in the room, whether that's 30% or 40% or 50%, depends how you define it. Culture does change because, you've got a collective of women approaching things very differently with different life experiences, different age groups, and so on and so forth. But if you can't get to that position fast enough, then I think you've got to do the pethau bychan, the little things. And I'll give you a couple of examples there. I mean, when I was working with a major devolution commission, there was a suggestion that we carried forward our conversations about really important decisions into a dinner, when we were meeting that evening. And, that seemed to me to be completely wrong for a whole host of reasons. A lot of women had childcare responsibilities, so weren't able to continue working into the evening in a way that some of the men were. And secondly, that in itself is quite an imbalanced and inequitable structure, because if you're sitting next to somebody who is particularly influential, you might have more input in terms of the decisions and recommendations than if you're sitting at the other end of the table. And by virtue of power, women are likely not to be in the prime position. So, you know, they're little things, but I think by raising your voice and saying, you know, that's not a good idea, it can actually change the culture quite subtly. And that will take longer than having a critical mass, but I think you can do the two things simultaneously.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yes, I agree. It's thinking about things, about everyone who's at the table, isn't it? And thinking actually we can't, you know, in terms of childcare, and we know again that COVID has had a massive impact, particularly on, you know, female labour in the work in the home, and, you know, homeschooling and managing work, and, you know, it's had quite a significant impact for women. So I think the little things, yes, the little things add up to the big things, don't they? Okay, so I'm going to go back to the list of questions. So what do you think is the most important leadership lesson that you've learnt in your career? So I think if we go to Caroline first of all on that.
Oh, Leanne, I could write a small book on this based on lots of mistakes I've made in terms of leadership. One of my earliest lessons I learned, which, you know, does wrap into the whole piece, is about not necessarily leading the way that you have been led in the past. Mm-hmm. Because it's easy to think that some of the managers I have worked for were leading. They were not. They were men, coincidentally. They were just managing. And leadership means many different things. I look back and think, you know, one of the biggest things is to become a really good follower. If you understand followership, you will also understand leadership. And to be a good follower, you need to obviously buy into the leaders, you know, morals and, you know, the way they're taking a team forward. And I also found that giving people their own voice within a team. So just before I left NatWest, I was leading leaders. Totally different ballgame to directly leading a team, because I wanted those leaders to create their own way of guiding their team, to be able to direct them, but also to motivate, coach and support them as leaders so they could do the same with their teams. I am also a huge fan of, I did a lot of work around building high-performing teams.
Yeah, again, they won't give you a point. So write down the correct spelling, professional English.
Right. That isn't me, by the way. Building high-performing teams doesn't necessarily need to be done in a traditionally masculine way. It's about, you know, really building on the strengths of your team and taking them to super strengths. And that's what I used to really enjoy in terms of leading teams directly. Getting the best out of people.
Thank you for that, Caroline. And yeah, I think you're right. The way that you've been led isn't necessarily the right way to lead other people, and teams are going to vary massively, aren't they? And you're going to have to.
And it's like everything, you know, what's happened to you as a child shapes your view of the world. And exactly the same thing happens in, you know, when you first have the mantle of leading a team. You revert back to the way that you were led, and that's not always the right way. So it sometimes can take a bit of unpicking.
Thank you, Caroline. If we can go to Sheila next, please.
I think the biggest leadership lesson for me is, and it's going to sound so simple, but always treat people as people. There's something in there about there's almost like a kind of ego or that goes on with leadership on times, which I think can be terribly unhelpful.
I agree. I'm not sure if there's a connection issue. You've frozen on my screen, not sure about other people.
Yeah, I think Sheila's frozen.
Yeah. Okay.
Shall I jump in, Leanne, while we're waiting for Sheila to come back? Yeah. I mean, like Caroline, we could write volumes on this, couldn't we? All of us, really, about good lessons in leadership and lessons where you've learned exactly how not to lead from somebody or group of people. So it's about retaining that knowledge and experience, I think, in terms of our own leadership actions. I mean, I think two things for me. First of all, don't be afraid to make mistakes. I think we really beat ourselves up as women, and maybe men do this, but I don't see as much of it. But we beat ourselves up when we make mistakes as leaders, or errors, or things don't quite work out as well as we would have liked them to. But I keep saying that actually in sport particularly, you learn much more from your defeats than you do from your victories. And it's really important to kind of process and analyze what went wrong. And sometimes the mistakes give you a little bit more trenchant self-analysis than anything else. So I've kind of learned that through my career. Rather than getting upset by mistakes, I kind of hopefully try and use them, to my advantage. And the other thing is, and I think we need to rehearse this more prominently in conversations about women sticking their heads above the parapet, because we are a minority at the moment, women in senior positions. Hopefully that will always be the case, which means that we are targets as well, whether that's on social media or from people who are just quite frankly jealous, And the thing I've learned is not to take any notice, because it's very easy to get personally hurt or insulted or upset by criticism or exposure in the media of something you've said or done, or something that's gone less well. But the reality is good leaders will always make mistakes, because they're not risk averse and they're embracing a more creative solution to something. And secondly, the best piece of advice I've ever been given is this too will pass. Nothing lasts forever, and it's tomorrow's chip papers, basically, isn't it? A bad write-up will be forgotten in a week, as long as you used it to your advantage and are improving your skills to do something better next time.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that lesson about making mistakes and not taking, and taking risks and not taking it personally, I think that can be a very difficult one for young girls to learn. I think where we're in school, there's a lot of, focus on behaving and being conscientious. And I think it's very difficult. And I think for me, I had to do quite a lot of work to break away from that and, learn how to make mistakes and learn how to take risks. So I think that is a really important leadership lesson. And finally, Cara, it looks like we've lost Sheila for the moment, so hopefully we'll be able to have her rejoin us soon. But if we move to Cara, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I've just got 5 very quick little lessons, and I think they reiterate much of what's been said. The first is, don't be afraid to disrupt and do things differently. Why would we ever want to replicate all that we've seen and experienced before? That would seem to be going backwards. The second is, and this one's really important to me, and I think to Cardiff Met as an organisation now, and it's about being authentic. I genuinely believe you will fail as a leader if you are not authentic or true to yourself. You are one holistic human being, and you cannot be one person at home and one person at work. You just trip yourself up. So you have to be authentic. And that means being quite open and transparent when challenged. The third one for me is that I think you need to be really clear about your values and live your values. And that obviously is aligned with being authentic. Your values, I think, should be your moral compass. They should help you determine decisions that you make within a workplace, and possibly help you determine, which workplaces you move to and from. Fourthly, and I think this is one that perhaps women struggle with, and I think it probably took me quite a long time to learn, we're so keen to prove ourselves, and I think sometimes the bar is higher for us, or we're not noticed. Therefore, we think we will be judged only on performance and outputs and outcomes, when actually that sometimes is at the neglect of relationships. And without the relationships in the workplace, and those come through, good communication, we'll fail. And there's a little saying about personality trumps performance, and I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and. but we mustn't just be so driven by proving ourselves that we forget to build the relationships. And then finally, one that I learned quite a while ago, I guess, when I first moved into a sort of more senior leadership role, and we all encounter difficulties, and, you know, as leaders, most of our time is spent on, you know, kind of difficult human resource issues. And I remember kind of concluding to myself and for myself, and it's something I've held on to ever since, this notion that nobody intentionally comes to work to do a bad job. Some people do a bad job, but that's not what they set out to do. And some people cause their colleagues and their students and, you know, workmates a load of grief, but that's not what they come to work to do. Nobody gets out of bed in the morning thinking, I'll go and do a bad job and make everyone's life a misery. And I think for me, that's that glass half full thing. You know, if you keep your glass half full and keep your mindset positive, no matter how difficult things are, relentless positivity generally gets you through. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, I think we've all had to dip into our positivity reserves recently, haven't we? And I think there is something around, you know, nobody coming to work to do a bad job. And I think sometimes you do. It can be difficult to see other people's motivations. And I think that is, you know, again, that's something that this COVID scenario has taught me, that actually when people are struggling, it sometimes manifests in ways that make it difficult, you know, to have conversations with them. But there is always a motivation there, isn't there? And I think if you can come around, try and understand where that other person's coming from, that can be a really valuable skill. So we've had lots of questions in the chat, which is really good to see. So we have got some more questions on the list, but what I'm going to do actually is ask one more question before we move on to the questions that are in the chat, and if anybody wants to ask anything else. Oh, nice to have you back, Sheila. Hi.
Yeah, thank you. My internet dropped out. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. We're glad to have you back. I apologise. That's my delivery. It was obviously meant to arrive today, but it's arrived early. So I apologise about that. So as I was saying, Sheila, I'm going to ask one last question before I move on to the questions that our audience have popped into the chat. So the last question from me is, to celebrate International Women's Day, what women inspire you and why? So Sheila, if we can start with you.
Okay.
Internet's
because if I get mid-sentence and then my internet goes again, it's looking very dodgy. Okay, so yeah, Michelle Obama is the person who inspires me, because of that combination of starting from a modest background, having the vision really and the personal resilience to keep on going, and believing in herself. And then when she got to being very visible, still being very real and being very honest about being very real. So I think in some of the terms I've used to describe her, I think are some of the key elements for success as a leader, or as a female leader as well, is that you've got to be prepared to stay in there. Sometimes you just think, oh really, do I really have to do this? Because nobody's kidding that it does take a lot of character, it does take a lot of stamina to stay in the game, and to ignore or to ride above or to challenge the range of different things that will come across your pathway. And that's a shine, you know, to me she's a shining example of someone who's done that, and has done it with such dignity and such honesty. I just really very much admire her. So so Michelle Obama would be my go-to person, as the person I put on the top of the list of people I admire in that regards as female leaders. And the other quality that she brings to me is that combination of doing that whilst being a mum. I, again, probably because of similar circumstances, I've been a mum since my mid-20s, so for virtually all the time I've been on the career ladder, I've been balancing it with motherhood as well. So I think that also adds to that kind of element. And I think, again, for me in that, it's about showing that it can be done. I think there's an awful lot of people who listen to the negative narrative about what it takes to be a mother and a committed mum and balancing a career. And to see somebody show that actually it can be done and done very well. And you can end up with balanced children who get that, that sometimes you can't always be there for them, but at the end of the day, they are the most important thing in your life. And I think that's, again, a shining example of somebody who stepped into that space and owned it so well.
Yeah, I agree. And if you haven't read her autobiography, I would, to anyone who's not in the audience, I would recommend that you read it. It's the way that she talks about her role and her children and her family and her own career is really wonderful. And I agree with what you just said, Sheila, about we don't see a lot of mums who in leadership roles who make it work and who are kind of honest about the difficulty. And like you, I think for me, having children has actually made me more ambitious, more driven, more organised, more effective. And actually that's the side of working motherhood that you don't see enough of, and it can actually do your career wonders. Yeah.
Agree.
And Laura, we can move to you next.
It's a really tough question, this, isn't it? There's so many fabulous women out there that have inspired me and helped me. I mean, not least my own mother, because I kind of grew up in a pretty ordinary family, and my mother left school at 14 and yet was incredibly political about wanting us all to do well, in that kind of classic Welsh working class way. But she was quite kind of angry about the clear divides that existed between the chances for boys and girls. And that's quite easy when you've been to university and perhaps, almost kind of theorized about this. But I think for a lot of ordinary mums in Wales, they felt that quite intensely, when they saw their own careers or their own lifestyles being changed in some way by not having equal opportunities. So I think that's quite a personal one. And then lots of mentors that have helped me along the way. But if I was choosing, two people from the fields I work in, politics and sport, I mean, I'd choose somebody like Julia Gillard in politics. I was fortunate to do an in-conversation with Julia, former Prime Minister of Australia, from Barry originally, by the way, her family. And first female prime minister, and just somebody who, if you look back at her career, was kind of incredibly controlled and very strategic about what she did, but was able to be really angry when things weren't fair and just. And I really admire that. I mean, if you ever want to see a fabulous video, watch her dismantling of Tony Abbott on a YouTube clip. Where she accuses him of sexism and misogyny. It's a fabulous example of controlled female anger. And by the way, I think women should show anger. I think we've got enough to be angry about in a lot of environments. And it seems that, anger is not a legitimate female emotion, so we're not allowed to show it. Well, if things are not fair, it's legitimate to be angry, quite frankly. And Julia Gillard does that wonderfully in the YouTube clip. And then from sport, just because, obviously I'm in the middle of an election campaign, I'm meeting national associations in UEFA on a daily basis. And there's somebody who kind of paved the way for me to contest this election. And whether I win or lose, I think we'll have made another dent in the discrimination that exists against women in senior leadership positions in sport. A woman called Moya Dodd, who's, funnily enough, I've chosen two Australians just by chance. Moya's Australian as well. She was one of the first women to sit on FIFA Council, appointed back in 2015, and then lost the election for the place 2 years later. And the reason she lost, without going into all the politics, is because clearly some organisations are not ready to have women who speak credibly and articulately and with passion about the field that they know about. But instead of kind of walking away, and throwing her toys out of the pram, what Moya's done is help people like me who hopefully will come, behind her to do what she did. And, Moya's constantly on the phone to me from Australia, giving me advice about how to contest the election and strategy and tactics for how to win people's votes, because, you know, any election, by the way, is not about being the best candidate. It's about how you coax people that you can help them and support them. So, I mean, people like that, I think, are really instrumental. You know, they're people who reach the ladder down to help other women rather than just pull it up behind them. So I think, you know, Julia Gillard, Moya Dodd, really fantastic, inspirational role models for me.
Lovely. Thank you, Laura. And Caroline, where do you take your inspiration from?
Yeah, like Laura said, there are so many amazing women. So what I thought about was, you know, I absolutely take my hat off to all the women out there who have made their way through, navigated the COVID pandemic while homeschooling and keeping down jobs. My children are 19 and 22. I am not sure I could have done that. So they are my absolute heroes right now. And it is a time that we will look back on and reflect for decades to come. I am absolutely certain. But I also thought about, more local role models. And then we've got Cara, Laura and Sheila on this call, you know, show grit, determination and gravitas in what they do. But also in Wales, we're surrounded by fabulous women who do tough jobs. You know, Kelly Burney, Sophie Howe, Katie Chamberlain, Alwyn Williams, Cerys Furlong. I could go on and on and on and on. So, and, you know, and these are in leadership roles. They also have fabulous teams around them. So there's lots of inspiration everywhere, and it's not too far from our front door.
Yeah, inspiration can be very close to home sometimes, can't it? Yeah, thank you, Caroline. And finally, Cara.
Thanks very much. And yeah, I mean, I think we take inspiration from all around us. And as I move towards the end of my career, I increasingly take huge inspiration from those at the beginning of their career who just seem to be so much more competent than I was when I was in my 20s. And I think, you know, watch out world, because the next generation of women are just going to be absolutely amazing. In Wales, you know, I think we're quite fortunate that I suspect it's the only country in the world where the majority of vice chancellors or heads of universities are women. So we've got 9 universities and 5 women heading, you know, 5 out of 9, which is quite incredible. We've got a female education minister who's done a good job at stepping down. We've got a female chair and director of Universities Wales, so pretty unusual. But further afield, I take a huge amount of inspiration from a number of women that kind of live their lives on the global stage. And I think I do that because I don't believe that gender equality can be achieved on a national scale alone. It's a global fight, and, you know, we cannot be equal in one nation without being more equal across the globe. And there I'm thinking of, you know, some of the women who've taken on the really hard fights. My Scottish compatriot, Baroness Helena Kennedy, human rights lawyer, who's really taken on the hard fight and taken it to the world and fought through the House of Lords for a number of really significant legislative changes. Someone like Arundhati Roy as a writer, a feminist and environmental activist, you know, a really amazing Indian woman who's a kind of fantastic global citizen, and I think has again taken on the big challenges. And then if I'm looking at journalism, someone like Orla Guerin, that Irish journalist that we've seen in numerous war zones around the world, you know, a role that traditionally has been undertaken by men. And again, I think, you know, if we can't actually manage to stop conflict and war, then we won't ever have gender equality. And she's brought some of those feminist arguments to war zones, which has been really helpful. And then a little bit closer to home for me, irrespective of your politics, Nicola Sturgeon inspires me almost every day. And anyone that can keep their cool in an 8-hour grilling where they're asked to apologise for the sexual misconduct of their male predecessor, you know, hats off to someone like her, but to all the other women and to those that come after us, because I think they've learned the lessons well, some of the lessons that certainly for me, it took me a long time to learn. Thank you.
Thank you. So a wide range of names that have been presented there. So if you are in the audience and you're looking for inspiration, then I think any of those names that we've mentioned are a good starting place. So right on schedule, we're now going to move on to questions from the audience. So we've had a few questions popped into the chat, some of which have received a few likes. So those would be the questions that I would go for first. But does anyone have a question that they would feel comfortable asking, either miking off or taking their video off? Just if you want to pop your hands up if you'd like to ask a panel, the panel members a question, please. Okay, so I haven't seen any hands go up, so I'll draw the questions from the chat. And we've got a question from Hannah. And Hannah has asked, what do you feel can be done to support women that work part-time to still be able to go for opportunities to progress in their careers? Senior positions are often full-time, but what can be done to support women to feel that they can also apply for these roles and can do the roles capably whilst working part-time? So if we can go to Cara first on that one, please.
Yeah, I think that is a perennial challenge, and we seem to have moved a little bit away from something that was perhaps more common 20 or 30 years ago, which was the job share in more senior roles. I think for me, one way around that is to divide roles and time periods into smaller chunks. So what we've seen traditionally is, you know, people get promoted by whatever means, some in previous eras rather dubious, and they hold on to those roles for a long period of time, and then somehow mysteriously they get passed on to someone that looks just like them. And I think what we have to do is disrupt that, not always by making these full-time permanent roles for long periods of time, but by enabling people to try things. So secondments, trial periods of a year, you know, roles that are not necessarily full-time, could be undertaken part-time. And certainly at Cardiff Met, we trialled last year, actually before COVID, but then it worked quite well through COVID, this notion of just moving around the organisation and trying something else and gaining new skills and making yourself better equipped for jobs that come up in the future. And I think that's also a way of, you know, helping people to get noticed. But no, we have to crack that. I mean, hands up, I don't think we have cracked it. You know, all of the senior leadership roles are all full-time, permanent roles. And we do need to think of ways of enabling succession planning to be wider than it currently is. But I think the secondments and the trials is one way forward. Thanks.
Yeah, as someone who's very much enjoying a secondment at the moment, I would echo that. It's really worth, you know, it's a really interesting kind of experiment to test your skills and also see if, you know, you do want to change direction slightly. It's a really nice opportunity. And Caroline, if you could, have you got any words of wisdom regarding part-time and flexible working?
Yeah, I've got a really cringeworthy example of 15 years ago of how I navigated myself around this whole situation. So my son and daughter were, I don't know, 1 and 3, so quite small, and an area manager role came up that I really wanted, but I knew I couldn't do it part-time. So I am not suggesting this is the way forward, just goes to show, you know, thought process at the time. I decided that I needed the recruiting regional manager to want me. So I applied for the job on a full-time basis, and I didn't make any reference whatsoever that I worked 3 days a week. And I thought, I'll get them to want me first, then I'll negotiate the whole part-time piece. And that was fine, because I was offered the role and I managed to convince them that, yes, I would take a full-time target across my 3 days, and it was much cheaper for the business because they would be paying me 3 days rather than 5 days. see where I'm going with this. And I am most embarrassed to share that all the majority of the branch managers who were male at the time were all full-time. And I didn't tell any of them, I was very flexible with my 3 days. I didn't tell any of them for 3 months that I was part-time because I was too afraid to. Mm-hmm. I just managed to move things around and dodge things around. So whilst there are some good things in there, there are not so good practices. Some of them were my own doing at the time, you know, in terms of my perception of how I should have been proud to be able to lead that team 3 days a week. I wasn't, because it wasn't the norm. Mm. And now I think the scene is much more set, not complete, to be able to have those conversations. But I was so desperate to do that role part-time, and I knew I could. Yes, I almost killed myself, you know, trying to do that and juggle family life and living kind of, I wasn't being authentic because I'd never lied about it, but I didn't offer the truth either. And actually, I made a decision of how I was being perceived. And that's a really good example of how not to do it. Yes.
Thank you for that. And I think it's, you know, as we've talked about throughout, it is important to acknowledge what, not necessarily mistakes, but what we would do differently, you know, around decisions that we've made in the past. And I think you can only make the decision that you think is right at that time, can't you? And hindsight is a wonderful thing.
I look back now and think, what part of your brain thought any of that was a good idea? But you almost have to do it to have that reflection.
Yeah, definitely. And Sheila, have you got any guidance around working part-time and supporting women who want to work flexibly?
Yes. In terms of working flexibly, I think there is a lot of scope, really, isn't there, for thinking about how we structure a lot of work environments that could lend themselves very easily to much more flexible ways of working. So the 9 to 5, or, you know, whatever shape that model has traditionally been, is more tradition than necessity in an awful lot of cases. So there are lots of ways of actually being able to support people to work much more sort of flexible hours. The one thing I would say, though, is that it's a very difficult. Sorry, actually, I missed part of this conversation as well, so apologies if I'm repeating anybody. But it's a very difficult and demanding role to take. So I think you've got to be kind of honest in terms of your self-reflection of whether or not it is literally doable, because I think sometimes you just work informally full-time. So you might not be full-time on the books, but you are in everything other than on the books. And so I think there's a bit of honesty in that. But the other side of that, though, is there the capacity to think of either working part-time or more flexibly, because flexible working can fix a lot of the issues around part-time working in and of itself. And then, as I say, sort of, you know, sort of, I'm trying to resist putting yourself in the position of trying to hold down that level of responsibility. I know, even though I work full time, and I have, for not all, but most of my time in work, there's something about this role, I think, that I say to people over in different sort of speeches I've done, that if you're the kind of person who needs to go home and put your work down at the end of the day, perhaps it's not the best time for you to think about taking on the most senior job, because it tends to be all-consuming. You live it, and you know, you sort of find solutions to problems. It's, you know, so, and I'm not saying that can't happen in a sort of flexible arrangement. It's just, I know that trying to balance all of that responsibility, all of those asks, that honesty about, is it doable within a part-time sort of way of working, and then is the work environment and the culture of that work environment going to support that to be a genuine part-time work experience, as opposed to, let's say, an unofficial full-time work experience?
Yeah, and I know colleagues who do work part-time in various industries, and yes, there is that issue, isn't there? Sometimes you do end up working full-time for part-time pay. And there is a great skill in learning when to say no as well, isn't there? And you know, just because we can have it all doesn't mean we should do it all. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think that ability to give yourself permission to not try and be Superwoman is incredibly important. I think a lot of us beat ourselves up, don't we, if we're not able to tick that Superwoman box. And I think that tends to be one of the gender differences, I have to say, I have found, where for whatever reason we almost like have our own score sheet, don't we, in terms of making sure that we're all things to all people all of the time, which is impossible. And so if there's one thing I would steal off my male colleagues is that ability to be more selfish and say, actually, no, not for me, thanks. This is my time, and I intend to use it that way. Yeah,
I agree. And I don't think it is so much being selfish, is it? I think it's about self-preservation. And if you
selfish in a non-punitive sense. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
I think there's also some language that can sometimes leak out as well, Leanne. Like I've heard people say, I'm only part-time, is the only, there's a devaluation there. And I think my biggest tip would be to anybody, there are lots of flexible working schemes out there. Be brave and ask, have a conversation about the whole piece, in terms of what, and there might be a negotiation there in terms of what the art of the possible is, so it works for everyone. That's what I would absolutely encourage.
Thank you. And finally, Laura, have you got any words of wisdom around part-time working? And
I think my colleagues have said it all, really. I think I'd emphasize Sheila's point about being able to say no to things and do it legitimately and with some, not feel apologetic about saying no. That's a hard one to learn, but it's a really important one, because I do think women tend to say yes to too much, and then we can't cope, or we struggle to do things, and then we go into that cycle of blaming ourselves for work not being perfect. But I think as well, leaders and our bosses need to also have a little look at themselves. Academia is a great case in point here. We became obsessed with this whole kind of workload allocation model phenomenon, which is a management tool at the end of the day. It has very little bearing on outcomes and what's delivered in terms of practical outcomes, and much more to do with the process. And I think when you deal with process, you'll find most male colleagues can play that game more effectively than women can. So I think there's actually, I'm waiting for the first really trenchant feminist critique of the workload allocation model in higher education. It'll come, believe me, it'll come, because you can see how this will play out, actually. So I think we've got to be mindful that some things which are well intentioned can actually backfire for women, and secondly, we need to say no a lot more frequently.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, if you do come across that evaluation of workload,
we'll have to persuade some of our colleagues to do one, I think.
Okay, so I'm going to take one more. I think hopefully got some time for one more question. And Gemma is one of our students who's in the audience, and she's popped a few questions in, so I'm really keen to ask one of Gemma's questions. So one of her first questions was, would you say resilience and fake it to make it would play a huge part? It shouldn't be the case, but when you are breaking off from the path, the hurdles can be massive, and it's as if you have to prove you are worthy despite having skills in abundance. So do you feel that fake it to make it has played a role in your careers? If we start with Laura this time.
Well, I wouldn't put it in those terms, but I understand what Gemma's saying, and I will say a little bit about resilience and general kind of toughening up and thick skin and all of that. And I, take this, cautiously, because I'm not one of these people who say, women have got to toughen up or we're not going to get there. I'm not saying that for a moment, but I think we have to take things slightly less seriously, which is a different dimension on this. And I've learned that certainly, there is a concept of resilience, which is actually based on looking after yourself and not allowing yourself to be sucked into accepting criticism around you and the things we've been talking about today. But equally, I think you have to keep your eye on the ball, as we'd say in football. And, you know, I mean, just taking my election campaign at the moment, you know, I have to do some things that in normal circumstances I wouldn't be entirely comfortable about doing. Okay, and I'm nothing terrible, I hasten to add, but, you know, you've got to get, if I'm serious about getting to a position where I can exert influence for women in football, then I've got to make the process workable, as in I've got to get to the election and win an election. And if I behaved in a way that was entirely true to every single thought that ever crosses my mind, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't get elected. So you see what I'm saying here? I think we have to just be pragmatic at times, and we have to be practical, and we have to accept that some of our progress will be based on compromise, you know, and it will be based on not necessarily doing what we would like to do in every situation. But that's professional life, quite frankly, and that's what I mean by resilience. You know, it's about accepting that, you know, things will go wrong around you, and it's not necessarily your fault, and it doesn't strike at the heart of your values and your skills if things do go wrong. So that's what I mean by resilience. And I also mean we need to kind of park our egos a little bit. I mean, women generally have much lower, are much less led by their egos than men generally. Of course, that's a generalization. And I think it's important to park your ego, because remember why you're doing something. You know, normally you're doing it for a bigger good, you know, to represent other women, or to represent a sector, or to add your experience and your weight to a scenario. So by parking our egos, I think actually in a kind of counterintuitive way, we build more resilience, because we're seen as a professional person rather than, you know, Laura or Caroline or Sheila or Cara, which I think helps us actually in terms of that resilience building, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you, Laura. And Caroline?
If I start with fake it till you make it, I wouldn't say that's a long-term strategy. I think there are moments, as Laura said, when you might be outside your comfort zone and you might need to borrow that behavior or mask that just to get through that little short-term piece. You know, if you had to do a pitch, I use fake it till you make it in terms of pitching. You just have to borrow something to get you through it. I think it would be, as I said, an unwise long-term strategy. And resilience is something that, you know, we see it's a phrase used in everyday life. It's used in job descriptions. But it's like a bit like trust. You have to build it. And sometimes you don't know how resilient you are until it's tested.
Yeah.
And that bounce back ability is the moment where you can need to reflect or use a mentor or a close colleague or friend to help you build on that resilience. And it's okay to have moments where you don't feel very resilient, actually. But, you know, if someone was looking through a job description, resilient tick, how do you know? Because you don't know until you're in hot water. I think Laura mentioned earlier, you know, social media. And, you know, there've been moments where I've had to draw on real resilience through some pretty awful trolling. But that's the moment of truth. What you do next, do you pull the duvet over your head and never leave your house again? Or do you sometimes borrow a little bit of fake it till you make it to get you through, to get you over the bridge to the next part of your journey? So it's not something you can pick off a shelf, resilience, but you have to keep building it and going back to it and not hiding from the thing which will help your resilience.
Thank you. And before I move on to Sheila and Cara, Gemma, who asked the question, has just raised her hand. So Gemma, did you want to add a comment?
Yeah, sorry about that. With the resilience part and the fake it to make it, I mean, do you think that women have got to be more resilient because they're coming up against more hurdles, and despite them having that ability and those skills to handle those hurdles and, you know, smash through them, that they have more, they've got to persevere more because of what they're facing, if that makes any sense? Sorry about that.
Lovely, thank you. I'm aware that we are running short of time though, and that our panel members may have to move on. So Cara and Sheila, do you have meetings at 2:30 or are you able to stay for a couple more minutes?
I can stay.
Probably
Yeah, a couple more minutes.
Yeah, lovely. So if we can just take responses to the resilience question from Cara and Sheila, and then I will wrap up and end the session. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. In relation to the fake it or make it, I feel pretty uncomfortable with that notion of deliberately faking it. It just doesn't sit easily with my kind of notion of authenticity and the values that I would hope people would lead with. I think, it is about that kind of value, pragmatism over performativity or performance. So I think Caroline's thing of, you might need to do something momentarily to get you from A to B, but as a short-term strategy, I think long-term it would just lead to self-destruction, and you can't be true to yourself if you're faking it at work. In terms of resilience, I think that's a great point. If I look around Vice Chancellors, there's 150 odd of us, 30 women. The women, it seems to me, have had more complex, convoluted journeys to get to the role of Vice Chancellor, so less linear career progression. They often had knockbacks. We probably couldn't have got through this session without talking about social media trolling. We've all been there, and it's pretty dark. And yeah, I think that's probably the area of life for women that requires most resilience nowadays. It's not actually what's happening in front of you in the workplace. If I go back to the beginning of my career, sexism and misogyny were pretty overt. You saw them coming. They're now much more insidious. And I think that requires a different sort of resilience. And I probably finished by looping all the way back round to the comment I made about networking and support systems. I think you've got to have those support systems ready to call on when you need them. It's, it can be tough at the top, and I don't think anyone should be expected to do these sorts of jobs on their own. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Cara. And final word today from Sheila.
Thank you. Yeah, it is a great question. I think I go back to really what Caroline was saying around, for me, it's a combination of what you fake. There are certain things that are just completely no-go, and those, your fundamental values, is your bottom line. Because I think if you let go of that, you actually start undermining your own confidence. And so the fake it to make it idea actually is reverse. So you really need to be drawing that line very, very carefully. But there's nothing wrong with sort of giving yourself that mental boost before you do a presentation, for example, or but I think fundamentally there are some things that are just you have to have as your bottom lines. And that brings me back to the resilience question, really, because I think for me, if you were to ask me what the single biggest characteristic has supported me as a Black woman in Wales to be in this role, it is resilience. Because if I wanted an easy life, and I, was somebody who gave it very easily, I could have done that so many times over. One of the issues for me is I get very despondent when people relate to me as, sort of celebrating just one aspect of me. It's as though the female aspect of me has got a voice and a legitimacy, whereas the Black aspect of me, people start fumbling and looking at their shoes. And how that plays out in terms of how you present and how you are almost like given a voice to present is very challenging. And to be able to continually push back. Again, that whole resilience piece is, I've kind of made myself a promise that I was going to walk out with the same straight back as I walked into this kind of environment in. And it really takes a lot on times to actually dig deep and keep going. Back to that point about being kind to yourself, being really careful in terms of your own self-management. Important to take care of your values, as I say, and your character, your beliefs. All of those things are unshakable. But within that, then that ability then to be another human being and allow things to play out around you. But you really do need to be able to take on a lot. And, you know, we all have days where we think, oh, not today, and I can't do that today. But, you know, overall, to just keep on pushing and making sure that people recognise the fact that you're proud of who you are and what you bring. And if they're missing that, that's their problem. And so, you know, really pushing back. And so I think, you know, and there is something celebratory about that in and of itself, because I think the more of us who do that, the more people will look and see that there are more of us doing that. And, you know, feel as though they're able then to take those similar steps. And I think the good thing about having networks and friends around you is you share that learning. And it's kind of how many people you kind of take along with you. I mean, the roles that I've done have been very much in my mind about building bridges. This is how I kind of like regard my career. And the one that I'm in at the moment, the Cardiff third sector, it really plays to that. And the numbers of times people, women, young women, black women have come to me and just seen me in that role and felt they wanted to speak to me in that context, I think is so heartening. And so I think in a way I feel as though I owe it to them as well as to me to keep on and keep on keeping on, and for them to be able to look and see that, you know, it can be done. And if she can do it well, you know, I can probably have a good go as well. And I think, you know, I think that's one of the fabulous things about things like this, where you probably realise we're sort of different personalities. We come from different spaces. We've got different interests, but you're all here and all able to sort of make that contribution. I think that's the really important thing for me, is that celebration of women, is recognising we are diverse. We have all these intersectional aspects of our lives. We have all these different backdrops to our lives, and yet we're here. And if we can do it, well, so many more can as well. So, you know, I just hope that that's something that gets taken forward today. And as I say, in terms of my bridge building, my own personal tick box, if that gets is what's taken from today, I think that'll be a fabulous outcome.
Lovely, thank you, Sheila. And those were some good words to end by. And I think throughout the answers that the panel have given us, there have been some themes that have resonated. And as you say, everyone's from different backgrounds and in different scenarios, but actually, you know, themes around authenticity and, you know, keep pushing on, and kindness to yourself and others are really important. And I think hopefully that's something that our audience members will take away with them for the rest of their International Women's Day and throughout the rest of their careers as well. So I'm going to make a few final remarks and then we are done for the panel. But a huge thank you to our speakers for your time today. It's been really empowering and reaffirming listening to you, and it's been a nice reminder of how far we've come, but also how we can keep on pushing forward with regards to women in industry. So the employability team will be sending out a link to the recording, as well as organisations that we know are doing lots of supportive and progressive work around gender and equality. So if you are a student listening in and you kind of feel empowered around your career decision making, then please see the career service for webinars, appointments and resources, and lots of other future events that they have planned. And just a final note of thanks from me, and this has been a highlight of my International Women's Day so far, and thank you to everyone for being such an engaged audience and for being such a fabulous panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.